and good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, taking the series forward on Indian writing in English, today we will be talking on post-1857 developments and Indian English. And for this discussion on the topic, we have once again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor from Department of English, University of Delhi. So let's welcome our guest, Professor Anand Prakash, and let's try to grab maximum knowledge through him. Hello, sir. Welcome to the EduSec lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, and welcome viewers. We are a part of the series of lectures, and a large number of them have already happened here. And today's discussion would be about post-1857 developments and Indian English. Now, look at the title and see the implications. One major implication of this topic is that languages react to, respond to certain requirements of the time when they are used for communication. And because times change, and times in fact are always changing in history, all of us know about it. Therefore, language also would change in the process. This is the implication of the topic, and particularly in the case of English, which was in the phase of formation in the 19th century, this is relevant. As we have discussed in other lectures, 19th century is a decisive century for India. It's a kind of a dividing, line between what happened before the 19th century and what happened during and after it. And this dividing line is to be understood in its various phases. 1857 is one dividing line. Before and after, India is crucially, totally in fact, different. And if that is so, then how did the English language, as it was developing in India, as it was forming itself in India, in the way it became a vehicle of expression for various people, in that phase, it was learning a lot from the society around it, and there were not as many people as there would be later to use the language, but then they were in a quite large number in India even at that time. Let's think about 1857 first. 1857 is so important that people fight over, debate about the word that can be used for describing this phenomenon. For a long number of years, till in fact the British were here as rulers, this particular happening of 1857 was called a mutiny. And mutiny is a loaded word. Subjects, people who are ruled, the public, these people are supposed to remain loyal to the regime, to the rule, to the rulers. And if they are not loyal, in fact, if they are disloyal, if they are not worth their salt, as they say, then of course they mutiny, then they revolt, then they rebel. And then, because they are not following rules, therefore people who rule or are supposed to rule, they say that they are flouting the norms of democracy, norms of life, norms of society, and therefore they should be condemned. And it's a word of condemnation that, the person who is supposed to help, the system in which one has evolved and come up, this person does not follow the rules of the system which gave so much to it. This is the implication. And there were Indian forces, Indian armies, and a part of them revolted against the British dictats. And therefore, it was called a mutiny. Was it a mutiny? Is the question. And in fact, this question was debated in the post-1947 period. And most of the activists in the national movement in the early part of the 20th century and before had, decided to critique, partly or fully, the regime that ruled them. And these people said that this cannot be called a mutiny because the real power lies with the masses, lies with the people. And it is they who determine the course of policies, course of implementation, course of happenings. And if these people do not feel satisfied by the policies of the regime and the implementation of the policies, then they have a right to revolt also. And therefore, it was in fact later on very significantly called 1857 the first war of independence. So it was a war of independence. And independence is a positive word, all of us know. We like independence. We want to work for the cause of independence. We believe in freedom. We believe in equality. And if somebody from outside, from elsewhere, from across so many seas, comes here and takes a grip on the economic and social resources, and they start imposing their own wish on the masses here, far away from their own country, then that in fact regime is unjust. That regime is actually flouting the norms of human life, the norm of equality. And if somebody revolts against it, then that person is supposed to be working for what can be called independence. So if that is the case, then 1857 is important. And what exactly was it, and how did it develop? Well, I don't have to go into this. Most of us know about it generally, in its general contours. And I'm not a student of history. I'm a person from literature. Therefore, I cannot go beyond a point so far as the implications of the word are concerned. But definitely, as a writer, as a reader, as a teacher, I would like to comment on the nature of 1857. And I realized that when 1857 happened, then the Britishers, who were earlier East India Company and who were supported by the British regime, but they were not directly involved. The British regime was not directly involved in the rule of the country. 1857 is the period when India was taken over as a colony by the British legally. And then Indian masses, Indian public would be answerable not to the diktats of a company, of an economic and trade company. They will now be directly subjects of the British Empire. Was it a good or a bad thing? Well, in history, nothing is entirely good and nothing is entirely bad. And one can say that a legal framework was available now, post 1857, and that what happened here could also be discussed back in England. And because the government was involved, and the government is always better than a company ruling through some other sources. Therefore, the status of the colony for India also may have worked to some advantage in India at that point of time. Later on, of course, the entire country stood up against the British regime, and they were compelled to leave in 1947. So keep this thing in mind, because a very ticklish issue is involved in what we discuss, particularly in these lectures, because we are using their language as our language. We are using in conditions where more supporters of English legally, socially, politically are there in the country, and they might be seen as imposing their language on us, and through language their culture. That is one possibility. And the other is that at that point of time, English will have to finally live with not just Indian conditions but also Indian languages. Therefore, 1857 is culturally very significant. Now we are having a language which is somebody else's language. We are using it as our language, as vehicle of our ideas to some extent. But then there are policies of the regime working behind all this. There are committees. We have already had a lecture, in fact 2 lectures on Macaulay's Millet. So there are committees, and there are agencies involved in the implementation of linguistic policies. And that implementation will encourage creative activity also in the country. And there will be many people who will express themselves through English in their ideas, in the expression of their ideas, as well as in fiction and poetry. So this is that particular connection that I think is important. And from here on, when we move further, then we raise other questions. Now, the first question I would directly talk about, I'll directly raise, is the question of what can be called the phenomena which is new in the post-1857 period. What is that phenomena? What is that new phenomena? And we have talked about it in other lectures, but then it is a modern phenomena. It is a national phenomena. And this new, the word new, the word national, the word, modern, these words have to be kept in mind when we discuss. So let's go into this. The modern phenomena is standing as an imagined community. What does imagined community mean? In fact, there is a book about this phenomena by Anderson, and that book's title also has the word, imagined community. So, what does imagined community mean in the 1857 period is the question that you can think about, which I'll think about, which means that there is no community as such, English-speaking community, or a community which believes in nationalism, or a community which believes in modern ideas. One wishes that such community was there, that there was a well-integrated, spontaneous, homogeneous community of this kind existed in the country, expressing itself through a language, expressing itself, with the help of ideas that will unite people. But that community was not there. And if it is not there, if India is not a community, and India doesn't have a community going by the association with English, therefore, what does one do? And that's why Anderson is using this word imagined community, which means that the community does not exist, but you imagine it. You have it in your mind. You have a map in your mind, and according to that, you move forward and you make a community later on. Or because you are conscious about it, and therefore your work involves more and more of inclusion of different lines of thinking, different lines of life and its principles. Therefore, that imagined community finally starts forming itself along lines that you have in your mind, that I have in my mind. So people start imagining themselves as Indians. Earlier, they would be having identity of caste, identity of religion, identity of sections in society, identity of regions, identity of languages. But this new identity is the identity of being an Indian. What does an Indian mean? Particularly in Punjab, what does an Indian mean? Is one a Punjabi? Does one have a religion and therefore should be known by that religion? Or is there a thing called Indian? Suppose the Punjabi or Rajasthani person, a citizen, starts calling oneself an Indian. What does it imply? It implies that the person imagines somebody else also elsewhere, like in eastern UP, like in Bihar, like in South India, Maharashtra, Kerala. So what does it, the person has not seen the other person. The Rajasthani has not seen the Keralite. The Punjabi has not seen the Maratha. And yet, all of them are bound by the word Indian, which means that people imagine that there is a friend there, and that I'm his or her friend, and therefore we can live together in the society as fellow citizens. And we are citizens then, not of this or that region, we are citizens of this country called India. Now, it's not as innocent as it looks. Today it does. I call myself an Indian. Anybody who lives here also would call oneself an Indian. But in the 19th century, this had some suggestions, some particular indicators. And therefore, if you call yourself an Indian, that very moment you became powerful. That very moment you became supported by the same kind of people elsewhere in the country. And if you had that, then social consciousness is very sensitive. And there were Englishmen here, and they had their families, they had their wives, they had their children, they had their jobs here. They also had something back home in England. So when you call yourself an Indian, what would the Englishman call himself or herself in the country? Imagine this. Put yourself in the shoes of an Englishman who is living in India for the next 5 years or 10 years. What would he call himself? He will call himself a British. So which means that a kind of a division occurs in the very use of the word Indian at that time. This is what I mean by imagine. This is what Anderson, the contemporary thinker and critic, says. The modern phenomena is based on what can be called imagined community, whereby large numbers of people come together to constitute that political and cultural entity known as the nation. Now, there is another word, cultural and political unity. Cultural and political, yes, cultural and political unity. Cultural unity, I belong to India, somebody else also belongs to India. Perhaps the culture is such, perhaps the belief systems are such. I believe in ideas that people elsewhere abide by, and they also might agree with me. Therefore, that kind of affinity with other people at the level of culture exists. Now, there may be many variations of culture, but then variations only mean that largely culture is the same, but within it there are variations. Now, see how language can be interpreted. So, culture is important, and in culture you have a scope for debate. You have a scope for getting together, sitting together, discussing, also having some kind of possibility of becoming in agreement later. That's what culture is. So, culturally this particular ferment has begun. Yeah, people start asking questions, they start giving answers to the questions, they start rethinking their own positions, and in that process they are getting together. So, the imagined is becoming more and more real with the passage of time. What about political? Well, this is an area which was not at that point of time sufficiently recognized in terms of ideas, and therefore people would not know how political India would be taken as a guiding factor in the 19th century. So, that politics would become important later, not in the years of 1857, not in 1860, not in 1870, maybe in 80 some kind of political formation emerges. That happens, but see how many years it has taken for the cultural idea to take the political form. And therefore, Anderson to that extent is right that the idea of a nation is both cultural and political. First, cultural, because you like people elsewhere, they are human beings, you are human beings, they live in a family, you also live in a family. At the level of family you can interact, at the level of what you read and what you believe you can interact. So, it is all culture. Family is culture, language is culture, literature is culture, ideas is culture, and people discuss more and more, and therefore they are having a kind of cultural view of the nation. What about political? I have already told you the serious things happening behind the word political, and these things are not for some time taken up. There was a bloodbath in the 1857 event, and a large number of Indians died, a large number of Britishers died, and there was kind of what can be called Khoon Kharaba on both the sides, and finally the mutiny, supposedly the revolt, the rebellion, the happening of War of Independence, that was mercilessly crushed. Let's not gloss over it. A large number of people died, they lost their lives, and what happened later on after that was something that is a subject of literature. So, large number of poems were written on this on this aspect, that Britishers were aliens, Britishers were outsiders, and that we are Indians. So, suddenly after 1857 this idea emerges, as I say, but it is an idea. Will it take a political form? That is for the time to decide and to unfold. And the people who have never met, this is the quotation, the political and cultural entity known as the nation is there, though they will never meet or even hear of each other. In the minds of each lives the image of their communion. In the mind it lives. In the mind you know that you are an Indian. In the mind you know that somebody else is an Indian, and that is important. What does English do to this? Well, English already has become a language, which is a vehicle of expression in India in the latter half of the 19th century, and people who write in English, they also are struck by these new ideas. They also are also struck by what can be called modernity, and this is where the people will take positions and they will talk about things that are relevant to literature. Cultural and political are the two words used. I am surprised that Anderson at this point of time in his argument in the book does not use the word economic. But can politics sustain itself without economics? Can culture sustain itself without economics? A person who believes, a person who shares his or her ideas with others, if a person who reads and writes, can this person survive without food, without a stable job? This question should be raised. And in fact, in the 19th century, there were very few jobs, there was very little education, and there was not much of work. In fact, 19th century was marked by a large number of economic distresses and destructions. And it was the century, which was of famines. And huge number of people, millions of people died in the 19th century of starvation. So somewhere the regime was responsible. The policies of the rulers were responsible, whosoever the rulers were. They were responsible for creating conditions in which people would die in conditions of famine and they would starve. This was the economic question. Now, this economic question should also have been raised at the time, that perhaps the conditions of life at the economic level will make people unite against people who are responsible for creating those conditions. So, this question was not raised, but then it was a jolt. 1857 was a jolt, and it was a jolt both to the Indian imagination on one side and the English imagination on the other. They also became very conscious that they can't rule this country forever if they do not take care of the problems that exist in the society at that point of time. So, there has to be some kind of an economic basis for this. Historians tell us, modern India historians tell us about this, that this was a century of destruction of the natural and the human resources. There were no workers. If there were workers, then they would not get work. And in fact, there will be a kind of a conflict between the Indian trade and the English trade. Things coming out from there in finished form are sold here, but the raw material here is not turned into finished goods here. There are no factories there, and it is exported outside, and from there it comes back as finished goods. So, this economic principle worked. It is because of this that 1857 happened. Not directly, but well, there is a connection. And in the 1857 onwards, some people would have started thinking that things which go from here as raw material and come back as finished goods, this particular activity should be stopped or at least slowed down, so that people here also have resources and they start working with them and create conditions of work. So, this thing was there, would have been there in 1860, 1870, 1880, and this question should have been gone into. Otherwise, it will be called merely literature, language and culture. Yes, literature, language and culture coexist and they integrate, but then all of them also have some link with the economic life, link with jobs, link with people moving around. After they have had good places as shelter and good places as places where they can work. So, I raised this question, and we should always read a book, always interact with thinkers on the basis of this kind of an idea, and if there are weaknesses, then we should honestly express our disagreement or our dissatisfaction with this. And I realized that if you call this only a cultural entity, only a political entity, 1857 and later phenomena, where our nation will not be having any kind of requirement of the economic base, then there is something weak about the content of this particular idea. So, this can be explored in so many different ways, but one important thing that has to be discussed in the context is whether in post 1857 there became a group interested in resources that would be more or less totally controlled by them. So, Indian weavers, the people who got the weavers some work and they started, they had the wherewithal of creating finished goods here, whether they would become active in post 1857. Whether there will be people with money at that point of time who would think of starting their own factories in India in the post 1857 phenomena. And if that is there, if people are investing their money and the people are Indians and that they have to live here and they have to grow up here as entrepreneurs, then of course India is going to change for the better, and it is going to have more and more stability, which will then create new questions before the languages like English and literatures like literatures by the Indians in English, and also at the same time others who would be using their own languages in India and who would be writing their own literatures for the benefit of the readers around them. So, this is the question which has to be put together in such a manner that all these aspects are brought in, and then of course a comprehensive view is formed. So, let us stop here and then we can discuss things further from here later. Thank you. The question that can be discussed in this lecture would be regarding the creation of capital, which is the Indian capital. And capital means resources, capital means money, capital means creation of jobs, so that people can expand their physical energies and make finished products, and those finished products fetch more amount of money from the market, and the money that comes back from the market is reinvested. This is called capital. And this capital in the earlier years is in the form of trade, is in the form of buying raw materials from here and sending outside and getting back that raw material in finished form of goods, and then trading them, marketing them, selling them here. This was the kind of capital that existed in India till the 1857-1860. But after that, the Englishmen, who were major traders here, and they had the money to invest, they might have thought, and there is an economic law working in society all the time. The economic law would be, why send resources from here, there, and then get it back, and why spend so much money on transport when you can create the same things here and sell them. So, this idea may have occurred at that time, and this idea had to take a legal form. Now, it was a colony, and as a colony it had to be administered at the level of politics, at the level of the British government. Therefore, if the law is formed, is made for investment in India, that applies both to the Englishmen and the Indians. So, imagine if the India becomes a colony, then something which works through its own sources of a trade company, then some kind of difference occurs. So, having a government directly answerable for making the policies and implementing them requires that things have to be done in a different manner, and they have to be more politically recognizable and acceptable. This is the new condition, and in this a law is formed that you should be encouraged to produce things, manufacture things here, and because most of the money at that point of time is with the British entrepreneurs, British traders, therefore they would like to invest. But the law has to be that people who live here, they would be allowed to invest money in resources in the not merely acquisition of resources, but also in the making in the activity of manufacture. And if that law is made, then it is applied to all people who live in India. So Indians also would have started thinking of investing their money, or whatever money they had, in the enterprises in the country at that time. So 1860 onwards, seeds of Indian capital are sown, and Indian capital will take 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to re-emerge as an important activity. But then these are very important years. 1860, 1870, 1880 are very important years for the growth of Indian economy, and the Indian economy would be of a different kind now than it was earlier. Earlier it was basically a trade economy, or manufacturing at the level of villages and small towns, but now it's an economy that will be centered around the policies of the government directly, and therefore the government having its stations largely in the towns and cities, the movement will become more and more telling, more and more palpable from the village to the cities. Now, capital is of two kinds. One capital that has been active earlier was the capital of money, that you buy something and then you sell something, and when you have more money than you require here, then you send that money back to your own country. Your own country means England. So the capital at that point of time was liquid, because manufacture would not be encouraged. But in post 1857, the manufacture would be encouraged here, and therefore the same capital which was liquid earlier would become solid capital. I am using very simple and apparently crude words, but then solid capital, that capital where you establish a factory here. You have jobs here, and these people come in the morning, go back in the evening, they get their salary at the end of the month, and that's how it goes. Therefore, this is solid capital. You can't move it easily from one country to another. Money you can straight away send, but not this solid capital. So in 1857 or 1860 onwards, India starts having this kind of a capital. There are towns which develop as places where workers will come from other parts of the country. They will live there, and they will work on the machines, and raw materials will be bought from villages and small towns, and will be brought here and gone back. And this kind of an activity will give a fillip to, will give a kind of push to the social activity and the economic activity. So this is happening in the 1860s. So this is to be kept in mind, and we have talked about society and politics, and to some extent economics also now. Therefore, now let's shift our attention from this to the world of ideas, the world of literature, to the world of the use of languages. And two words which are very important in the second half of the 18th century, which we are discussing today. These words, for instance, Bengal Renaissance occurred in Bengal, obviously, and there was a university there. Now, universities also came up in the later years from there to in other parts of the country, and a kind of interaction between different universities, the products of the university, the students and teachers, that started happening, and a kind of cultural development could be seen in the bigger towns in the bigger cities of India around this time. But then it was mainly confined to Bengal and to other centers like Bombay and to Madras, then Madras, now Chennai. This thing is there, but in this particular part, what is missing is the North India. In North India, there is not much of an awakening, there is not much of new ideas, there is not much of modernity. And in the 1857 year onwards, you have North India also enlivening, also becoming energized, so that people start thinking along different lines. And this happens in North India in the form of what can be called reform movements. The first reform movement, of course, was in Bengal, and it was called Brahmo Samaj. And Brahmo Samaj was a movement that was driven by rationality, that was driven by secularism, that was driven by modern ideas, and English was at the center of Brahmo Samaj, and all the great thinkers we have talked about. These thinkers and knew many languages, and they could translate from one language to another, and they were quite successful, not merely in communication, but in all kind of interaction. And if that is the case, then Bengal would have forged ahead. In the same way, later on, Bombay would have forged ahead. At the same time, Chennai would have, Madras at that time would have forged ahead, and they were becoming centers of production and centers of good, more effective communication. This was the case. What about North India? What about Punjab? What about Rajasthan? What about Delhi and surrounding areas? What about UP, which at that time was United Province? The small, two letters are the same. Today is Uttar Pradesh, and that at that time it was United Province. But then UP was there. So they remained untouched for a number of decades. But then finally they also caught up. And they caught up with the help of reform movements here. So Brahmo Samaj may be the first inspiring reform movement in Bengal, and ideas from there would have shifted, would have moved from there to other parts of the country. They also came to the northern India, and there were two centers in northern India, and they became much bigger educational centers with the passage of time, and these were Aligarh and Lahore. These were the two centers, and Aligarh is associated at that point of time with the word called Anglo-Arabic. Anglo-Arabic, mark the word that Arabic is the old world symbol, and Anglo, that is English, is the new world symbol. And these two symbols are now fused into each other so that it becomes one symbol. It's called Anglo-Arabic, which means that you will have a nice idea, a deeper idea about your tradition. We will think more and more about our history now, and we would like to see good things in that history so that we can imbibe those good things. And if we find that history blocked by certain wrong ideas, certain bad tendencies, then we would be critically aware of their role and try to take care of those wrong notions, wrong ideas, orthodox values, and we will forge ahead into the era of modernity. So this is the Anglo-Arabic part that is to be understood this way: tradition and modernity, new ideas, old ideas, one language, another. Arabic language is good so far as classical literature is concerned, and ideas of the old are concerned, and English is important because some new ideas which have emerged in Europe and England, those ideas we should know what those people say, what those people think, what those people cherish as values, and whether the same can also be transferred to our place, and we can also start enjoying the benefits of those new values. So this kind of a thing emerges in northern India in the Anglo-Arabic form, and there is a university, there is a big institution at that point of time, and there is a big visionary at that point of time called Sir Syed Ahmad. He belongs to this particular period, and he is a visionary, and he is asking ordinary people at that point of time. He is asking young men, he is asking them to come over to the universities and to get education in a modern way, in a way that could not be envisaged earlier. Universities is a 19th century phenomena. Otherwise, it would be all madrasas and temples, mandirs. And madrasas and mandirs, being religious places, they would always have a different kind of knowledge. But in the universities, our knowledge would be more open. There will be no set definition of how the world came into being and things like that. People start from the present and they go either towards the past or towards the future. But they start with the present. So universities generally start with the point of the presence. What is there? You become aware about what is there in front of you, what is there in front of me, and then we start learning lessons, and then we can move in different directions. So university started from the knowledge of the present to the knowledge of the past and the future, whereas religious institutions were all the time starting from the beginning, and the beginning had to happen somewhere, and well, I don't want to go into that question, but then adhering to those principles which had begun earlier. So there is a basic difference between the education in the universities and education in religious places. And this particular point that I am making also refers to the other movement which happened in Punjab, and this movement was called Anglo-Vedic. Anglo-Arabic, Anglo-Vedic. And what does Anglo-Vedic mean? That you have certain texts, certain scriptures which are very progressive, which are very rational, which are very uplifting, and they have a lot to give us, and therefore you go back to the Vedas, you read them, you take inspiration from them, and then you become active in your life. And in the meantime, historically speaking, you would see that some encrustations, certain dead wood, certain layers of thought which have become dogma, they also start surrounding the old principles of life which are enshrined in the Vedas, and therefore you become aware of these orthodoxies and remove them. So DAV movement, this Anglo-Vedic movement was strong on this particular aspect, and it was much more reformist than other movements of the time. And the DAV movement, the Anglo-Vedic movement, that said that from the wisdom of the Vedas, you critique whatever happened later on. And in fact, there was a kind of attack on even casteism in Anglo-Vedic attitude, and this particular thing had to be kept in mind. So read English, learn the ideas from the Western countries, imbibe those ideas, at the same time have strength from your own ideas, which start from the great scriptures of the Vedas, and where you have that sense of curiosity, that sense of wonder, that sense of fearlessness, that sense of dreaming, and of course that sense of rituals, because Vedic rituals were there. So rituals, and they are positive role, principles, they are positive role, and if they are not needed now, then to revise them like this, and also reframe your definition of the systems that emerged in society at that time. So DAV movement became a very sweeping movement, a very big movement, very inspiring movement, and it gave a large number of nationalist leaders to us. So in fact, you see that in the 19th century, latter half of the 19th century, the DAV movement and the Anglo-Arabic movement, these movements have contributed a lot to the making of the national movement, and the power came from their sense of modernity. They brought back the old times to the present. They used the present time to look back at the past critically, and they created enlightened individuals. So it's a kind of enlightenment that occurs in the latter half of the 19th century, and this enlightenment has social connotations. It has connotations of living in the present and making a way for the future, and this is what is required. So in a way, at this point of time, when India is active in the towns, in the cities, in the villages, and is trying to bring all of them together, and when a new perspective is being formed, which will be the perspective of reform, which will be the practice of enlightenment, looking at things critically and analyzing them, and throwing away if they are wrong, and adopting if they are good. If this kind of openness is there, then this is good for the country, and this will definitely make the country go further. About the English language, already Anglo-Vedic and Anglo-Arabic, that means that you will have to learn this language, and you have to be conversant with the books written in English and in European languages, and a large number of books have to be translated from other European languages into English so that they become available to us in India. So all this process, it has already begun in the 1780s onwards, but then this process is further intensified in the latter half of the 19th century, and reform movements contribute a lot to the might, the intellectual, social might of the country. So this is the point that is to be kept in mind as we go further ahead. Now please do not forget, and I have already mentioned, but let me repeat, that the parentage of the two reform movements, the Anglo-Arabic and Anglo-Vedic, the parentage was the Brahmo Samaj. See the similarities. English was the center of Brahmo Samaj. English is also here, more or less at the center. And Brahmo Samaj did not completely wipe out. In fact, Brahmo Samaj was using the knowledge available through Sanskrit, and that has come to the DAV, to the Anglo-Vedic movement in North India. So, certain kind of attitude has been evolved by Brahmo Samaj vis-a-vis society. vis-a-vis the social evils. And these ideas have also been taken from the Brahmo Samaj by these new reform movements in India, in North India, and this Samaj movement, this enlightened movement also touches very vitally the people in the south and people in Maharashtra, and Dalit movements and Dalit thinkers would emerge in this particular area. I think we already have a lecture on Dalit thinkers in our series, and where we know that these movements springing from different parts of India, they will converge and they will become a one important integrated nationalist phenomena. And this is occurring at this time in the latter of the 19th century, and this phenomena is giving more and more of power, more and more of currents of energy to the society at the time. So it's not a dead society now. It might have been somewhat close to being static earlier, but in the second half of the 19th century, it becomes a very lively society. A society, where young people are coming up, they dream, they go to schools and colleges, there they read, there they wonder, there they experiment, and they come back and they sit with people in their own villages and small towns, there they talk with them, and when other ideas also come from elsewhere, then they rebut those ideas, and this way the scene has already become more and more lively, as I pointed this out. So the parentage of the two, Anglo-Vedic and Anglo-Arabic, being Brahmo Samaj, which is English-centric and in the positive sense reformist. Reform can also be slightly negative, but it is in the positive sense. You are reforming things, to become better. So in a way, you are not reviving. It's not a revivalist movement. It's a reformist movement. You want to become more and more modern. You want to go ahead, go further into the future, and that being the requirement, you are basically living in the present for the future. You are not living for the past. So that is very important. That's why I say it's a positive reformist movement at that time. This can be called moving of the idea of northern India, etc., to different places in the country. Already I have mentioned two places in North India, and it is there in Bombay, it is there in Maharashtra at that time, and it is there far away in the south, where in fact a stronger Dalit movement is taking roots in the southern part of India. Then now we can think of the factories that I was talking about, the solid capital that I was talking about. This went in accompaniment with what I am saying at the level of languages and ideas. I have not yet talked about English in particular, but then that will be the final point with us today in this discussion. But then let's first touch upon the idea of the economic development in the country at that time. Railways is already there in India, and that's a big industry, moving of goods from one place to another, and compelling people to make things here so that they then can be transported from one place to another. So that means of moving things from one place to another is already available to us in India at that time. And then you pick up certain centers where raw material is already available in some amount. So there you establish factories and you make them industrial towns, and things will start then making goods, finished goods there. Money comes from Indians. Money also comes from the Britishers who invest in the factories here. And in the northeast, for instance, in the 19th century, you have a very big investment into the tea gardens. In the south, you have coffee plantations. All this is happening in the 19th century latter half, and this capital, this industrial activity, this activity that involves making of goods available in the market for sale. This is what a new kind of system is. The system didn't exist in the 18th century. The system that is there in the 19th century, this is giving a spurt to human enterprise. And this human enterprise finally will start asserting itself. The question is, how will it assert itself? Please think about it, that if there is an economic activity, if there are economic groups, if there are people who are investing, if there are people who are through investment growing up further and they have a bigger hold, a stronger hold on the economy at that time, how will these people express themselves in society? In economics, they are doing it. They are getting more and more of resources. They are creating jobs, and with the creation of jobs, they are getting a whole army of workers. So a factory may have 100 people, 200 people, 500 people. So if you have 500 people working for you, and you have the money in your hands, then you become very powerful. You are not an ordinary person. If next door somebody else is also doing the same thing, and this person is a Britisher, and you are an Indian here, do you think when you work together, when you work in in competition with the other person, and also with some kind of an agreement, then a sense of equality has already been established. The British entrepreneur and the Indian entrepreneur in the market are connected with each other through money. So money is a neutral force. So if you have as much money as the next entrepreneur, then you are equal. So already in society, equality has been established. So if there is economic equality, that will someday express itself as political and social equality. This is the law of life. So therefore, if there are two rich people and they sit across the table and they interchange, they exchange goods and then they exchange views, then of course they are equal. So equality has been already established at the level of life, and this sometime later maybe also express itself in other areas of life. So this is where economics is not economics. Economics is actually society. It is the life of society. It is the sustaining force of society. So if a society has jobs, if a society has money, if a society has facilities, if a society has already created individuals who are equal in life, then of course the society is changed. So nation at one point of time, as we have said earlier, at one point of time it's a cultural idea. With the upcoming of industry, it is not any longer merely a cultural idea. It has become a social and a real active idea in life. So you have this thing that Indian nationalism along economic lines now develops. This point is to be actually reinterpreted slightly differently. Can there be economic nationalism? There are books written on this. There are researches done on this. The famous modern India historian Pipin Chandra, he had his thesis on economic nationalism. What does economic nationalism mean? It means that you have factories here, you make goods here, you compete with the British capital here, and you are joined at the level of Indianness. So you are an Indian, somebody else is an Indian, and you can get together, and both your fates are tied to your capital in the country. Whereas the other person, the British capitalist, he also has his fate aligned with something back home. So there is a kind of a schism, there is a kind of a gap, a kind of a fissure that is developing between the British capital and the Indian capital. And the British capital is dualistically important. And it's important in the sense that it has alliance elsewhere. At the same time, the capital is here. So physically the capital is here. Control in one case is from the outside world. Control in the other case is from within India. Therefore, you have the Indian capital at that point of time. What does it mean? It only means that Indian capital will now express itself in political terms also, and that is to be kept in mind. So the last point, and on which I'll finish this particular lecture, that is that activation of Indian languages, an offshoot of English interaction later, and this is what is important. English is important. It is the language of trade. It is the language of political communication and dialogue, and it's quite effective. But Indian languages in the second half of the 19th century are not far behind in their evolution. They also are coming up, and they will evolve further. And in fact, very soon you will see from 1880, 1890 onwards that Indian languages will far outweigh the importance of the English language, and a new kind of consciousness will emerge, and that consciousness will find Indian languages more suitable for its expression than the English language at that time. So Indian English is there. It had a kind of flowering in the middle of the 19th century, and towards the end of the century, after the 40-50 years, it's being relegated to the background, and once again Indian language will come forward. But will English stay quiet? English is the language of political discourse. English is the language of political unification of the country. All political leaders in the country, they speak English and they interact through this language. So a very intense give and take, a very vital kind of relationship between different languages exists, and English will now be on its own as an independent way to express. It will have some kind of a patronage, but nobody will bother about the patronage when the Indian national movement sets in, and therefore let's see how Indian English in the later years evolve itself as a vehicle of expression and as a vehicle of many other things, that it stirs, that it disturbs, that it activates, and that it inspires. So with this kind of an open-ended conclusion that Indian Indian English will be on its own in the later half of the 19th century, and from there on it will create its own course and play its own role, and what happens later, that can be covered in other lectures. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very precious session. And dear friends, if you want to give a feedback for this particular lecture, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again tomorrow and would be discussing on another topic in the series on Indian writing in English. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.